Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about blood. We're going to go back a little bit. I know we started with the heart, but now we're going to talk about blood. So what we're talking about today is blood, right? So blood circulation, what is the function of blood? Why do we have blood? What does it do? What is the composition of blood? That means what is it made up of? What are the different formed elements in the blood? What else is in the blood? Also, where are these blood cells produced? So we know that they're produced in the bone marrow, and that process of production is called hematopoiesis. And then at the end, we'll finish up with some blood disorders. So blood circulation. So we talk about this whole unit as being the circulatory system. So we can divide the circulatory system into actually two different systems. So a lot of people interchange circulatory system and cardiovascular system, but cardiovascular system is very specifically just the heart and the blood vessels attached to the heart. So the whole cardiovascular system with the blood inside the cardiovascular system. And then we'll talk about the lymphatic system in a different lecture. And the lymphatic system is part of the circulatory system, but it's not part of the cardiovascular system. So that's the separation there. So what is the whole point of blood? Why do we have blood, right? Blood is pumping through the blood vessels by the heart, but it's pretty much a transport mechanism for a lot of different things. So it's going to transport nutrients, right? Things that we've eaten and we've broken down into nutrients. We're going to transport those around the body. We talked a lot about the endocrine system and how do those hormones get around the body to those different glands. Well, they're transported in the blood. So signaling molecules such as hormones and other molecules that we haven't talked about, but hormones we've talked quite a bit about. The big thing most people kind of associate with blood are the respiratory gases. So they're going to bring oxygen around the body, right? But we're also going to get rid of some waste. So carbon dioxide is a respiratory gas, but it's also a waste. We also have other wastes. Just normal metabolism in our cells is going to produce a bunch of waste. So we have to get rid of that somehow. So the blood is a way of transporting that waste to the certain organs that are going to get rid of that waste, such as a big one would be the kidneys. So this is just writing out a lot of what I already talked about. So, we're going to transport the oxygen and the nutrients to all of our body tissues. And we're going to talk about vessels in a different lecture and the capillaries and how leaky capillaries are to allow this diffusion of oxygen and nutrients across those capillary walls. And we know they're carrying hormones for the endocrine system. But a big one too are the different types of cells, and a lot of those cells are part of the immune system. So we'll have a whole lecture on the lymphatic system and the immune system. But another thing that we don't really think about either is that blood helps to regulate the body temperature. So we said a little bit about movement and muscles generating heat and regulating body temperature. Well, you also can perfuse different areas of your body, meaning you can either, bring more blood to or take blood away from different areas of your body. So if it's really hot, you want to have all your extremities full of blood so that you can have evaporative cooling via sweat to help cool yourself off. Or if it's really cold, you can take that blood away from the extremities and just keep it in the core, in the torso, and help just keep those important organs warm and for survival. So again, it's a big thing for body temperature is blood circulation. So what is the blood actually made up of? So we call that the composition of blood. And don't worry too much about blood volume. Just kind of think, on average, the average human has about 5 liters of blood. Males a little bit more, females a little bit less. It just really has to do with body size. So blood, I know we talked a little bit about it when way back in the beginning we were talking about connective tissues. So technically it is a connective tissue because it comes from the mesenchymal stem cell line, but that's really the only reason. It doesn't follow a lot of other rules with connective tissue. So the majority of the blood is blood cells. So blood cells are just formed elements, and we'll talk about all the different types of blood cells. And again, we call them formed elements because not all of them are complete cells. They're fragments of cells and things like that. So we have blood cells, and then we have plasma, and plasma is just the liquid portion of the blood. So we'll talk about what are the components of plasma as well. So it's not just water. So the majority is water, but we'll talk about what those other things are in the. So if we look at what's actually in the blood, how do we actually calculate all of these different things or give it a quantitative value? So essentially we take whole blood and you draw it out of the person or the animal, whatever that may be, and you spin it down. And so you spin it down and it layers out. So the heavier products are going to go to the bottom, lighter products are going to go to the top, and then you have a middle layer as well. So the very bottom layer is full of red blood cells. Okay, so we can measure the amount of red blood cells in the blood, and we call that value the hematocrit. Okay, so the hematocrit is essentially a percentage. So what percent of the blood is red blood cells or erythrocytes? And the average hematocrit that you're looking for, is anywhere from about, mid 40%. So 45%, 47% for males. And you can kind of have a range of plus or minus 5% can be normal. And this value varies for different species as well, and different athletic ability too. So sports people tend to have a higher red blood cell count. They've just trained their body over time to have more red blood cells and more oxygen carrying capacity. But anyways, hematocrit means the percent of red blood cells in the blood. And then the middle layer is just this white layer. It's very small, and that is the buffy coat. So just this little layer right in the middle is the white layer, and it's the white blood cells. So think white blood cells. It also consists of the platelets. So the red blood cells are in the hematocrit. The white blood cells are in the buffy coat. Then the rest of it is the plasma. So it's the majority of the blood is the plasma. If you think about it percent-wise, it's about 55% of the whole blood. So the majority of blood is plasma. Okay. But it's the least dense of the products in the blood, so it's going to be at the top. This picture just shows you how we spin down blood. So you draw the blood, spin it, and that's how you get the 3 different layers. Okay. So let's look at the blood plasma first. We said it's not just water. It's mostly water, 90% water. And it doesn't have the consistency of water either. It's kind of a yellow color, kind of a straw yellow, so kind of a light yellow. And it's also sticky. So it has a lot of protein in it, so it's sticky, kind of like we talked about joint fluid. And joint fluid is very sticky. It's not quite as sticky as joint fluid, but it's definitely not like water. So what does it actually contain? Well, it has a lot of stuff in it, but we'll just kind of break those down into categories. So it has ions, right? So ions, you can think electrolytes, like sodium, chloride. It's going to have potassium, calcium, all those ions that are going to be in there. It's going to have nutrients, right? We just broke down all that food into simple sugars, our amino acids from proteins, lipids or fats, right? So we're going to break all that food down into these simple nutrients that are going to be carried in the blood. Wastes, right? So we said that, we're going to have carbon dioxide, we're going to have these different metabolic wastes, and that consists of urea and ammonia. Okay, so these different wastes just from normal metabolism in our cells. But the proteins are the big ones. So we're going to have these proteins, and these are going to be some of the important things that make plasma what it is. Okay, so we'll talk about these proteins. So what are those proteins? So we have three main proteins in plasma. So the first one is going to be albumin. So albumin is the largest protein, so it's a very large molecule. And essentially it helps with the osmotic pressure in the blood vessels. So what does that mean? It prevents water from leaving the blood vessel. So it keeps the water inside the blood vessel. So it maintains the volume, the water in the vessels. Okay, so that's all you have to really worry about for albumin. It is a carrying protein as well. It carries some stuff in the blood, but really think it prevents the water loss out of the blood vessels, maintains that osmotic pressure. The second type of protein is globulins. So there's multiple types of globulins, but I just want you to think of them all together. But when we think about globulins, think about antibodies. So a lot of them are antibodies, and some of them also transport stuff. So they're going to transport some minerals like iron and copper, transport some fats, because the fat, since it's a lipid, it doesn't like the water of the plasma, so it's going to have to be carried by a protein in the plasma. Okay, but really think the immune system and antibodies when you hear globulins. Okay. And the little picture over here on the right is just showing you it separates out the different proteins in the plasma. So, and the red line is showing the relative size of them. So if you notice, albumin is the biggest, so it has the biggest peak, and then it separates out those four different globulins. So these alpha, beta, and gamma globulins. Okay. So different kinds of globulins, but again, think antibodies and kind of carrying transport proteins. Okay. Now the last type of protein is fibrinogen. It's not on our little graph here, but when you think of fibrinogen, think blood clotting. So it's involved in the clotting process of blood, and we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the lecture. But fibrinogen equals clotting. So let's go through our different formed elements. So our different blood cells, okay? So we have red blood cells, which are called erythrocytes. Those are the main name. That's the actual name of them. And then we have white blood cells. So we have multiple types of white blood cells, but all of them together are called leukocytes. So that's the main name for all the white blood cells. And then we have platelets, which are the cell fragments, right? So we said they're not full cells, which is why we kind of term everything formed elements, okay? So if we look at our picture over here, the majority of these cells are red blood cells. So that's these pink guys all over the slide. And then we have multiple white blood cells in a couple different kinds, and they're bigger, they're kind of funnier looking, you can see the nuclei. And if you notice, the erythrocytes, the red blood cells, don't have any nuclei. which is kind of weird, and we'll talk about why that is. And then these little itty bitty little dots everywhere, those guys are the platelets. So they're itty bitty little guys, just little fragments in amongst all the other blood cells. Now, to be able to see the cells, we need to stain them. But don't worry too much about the different types of stain and what that means. So let's first talk about those red blood cells, or erythrocytes. Their whole job is to transport oxygen, right? So they are the things that are carrying the oxygen from the lungs to the cells of the body. They are the most numerous, so we have the majority of our blood cells are red blood cells. They have no nuclei, like we just talked about in the last slide. They don't have any organelles. So remember way back when we were talking about some different cells and tissues, and these guys have no organelles whatsoever. So it makes room for the one thing they do have, and that's hemoglobin. So they're chock full of hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is a molecule that carries oxygen. Okay, so a hemoglobin has an iron molecule in that hemoglobin, and the iron is what is actually binding the oxygen molecule. Okay, so one hemoglobin has 4 iron molecules, and each iron molecule can carry 1 oxygen. So that means each hemoglobin can carry 4 oxygen molecules. Okay, but each cell is chock full of hemoglobin. So each cell can carry lots of molecules of oxygen. Hemoglobin is also red, so that's what actually gives the red blood cells the color red. Okay, so it's just chock full of this hemoglobin, this red hemoglobin molecule. So what's the whole function? It's going to pick up the oxygen in the lungs, deliver that oxygen to the tissues. So it has a funny shape too. If you've noticed, it looks kind of like a donut without the hole in the middle. It just kind of has a depression in the middle. Okay, so we call it biconcave, meaning if you look at each edge, okay, so that's a concave surface, and then this surface is also concave. So biconcave means that it's going to increase the surface area. Okay, so that just means more binding surface area for oxygen. So it's mostly hemoglobin. They don't even have mitochondria. Okay, so none of those organelles. But you might say, okay, well, mitochondria gives cells energy, right? Makes ATP, but they require oxygen. So you may say, okay, well, this cell is carrying a ton of oxygen. Why can't it just use some of that oxygen that it's carrying? Well, it doesn't. It doesn't use any of the oxygen it carries. It's only carrying that oxygen to deliver it to the tissues. So they are able to produce energy without oxygen, and that's called anaerobic metabolism. So they essentially use sugar instead of oxygen for energy. So now let's talk about our leukocytes, or our white blood cells. And these are our immune cells, okay? So they protect the bodies from any sort of foreign pathogen, any infectious microorganism that's not supposed to be there. These guys originate in the bone marrow, right? They're going to be produced in the bone marrow, and then they're going to circulate throughout the body. So the thing is that they start in the bone marrow, they end up in the bloodstream, they circulate around the body in the bloodstream, but then they leave the bloodstream or the blood vessel and go out into the tissues. So they function outside the bloodstream in that connective tissue and to attack any sort of pathogen. Because if you think about it, where are you normally exposed to a pathogen? That's going to be maybe a cut in the skin, in the respiratory system, in the digestive system, anything that's open to the environment. And it's going to hit whatever that connective tissue is first, not the bloodstream. And so when these white blood cells leave the capillaries, it's called diapedesis. So what are the different types of leukocytes? So we have 5 total types of leukocytes, but we can group them into 2 categories. So our first category is called a granulocyte. And these guys all end in "-phil", so that's how you can remember that it's a granulocyte. So neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils, okay? And why I have neutrophils starred is because they are the most common, most abundant white blood cell, okay? And then our other type is called a granulocyte, and they end in "-cyte", so lymphocytes, monocytes, okay? And so the difference between the two, granulocytes, granulo, means it contains granules in the cytoplasm of the cell. Agranulo means without granules. So these guys, the granulocytes, have granules, and we'll see pictures of that. And then the agranulocytes do not have granules in the cytoplasm. And then I have neutrophils starred, and then I also have lymphocytes starred because they are the second most abundant leukocyte. So if you just look at the picture over here, we have highlighted our leukocytes in the middle. So we obviously don't have as many leukocytes in general or total as we do platelets and red blood cells, erythrocytes. So if we blow up that and look at the sheer number or percent of these different types of leukocytes, we notice that neutrophils is the highest at 50 to 70%, and then second highest is lymphocytes, okay, at 25 to 45%. And you don't need to know the percents, just know that these two are the most abundant leukocytes. So let's go through the different granulocytes. So number 1 is our neutrophil. They're the most abundant, and we've seen these guys in lab. They have a bunch of different lobes of the nucleus, so that's something special. So you notice this guy has about 3 different lobes, looks kind of funny shaped, and very odd nucleus, and they all look different from each other. And then if you notice the little pink spots in the cytoplasm, those are the granules. So they kind of have this kind of pale red, kind of blue cytoplasmic granules, okay? Now these guys, neutrophils, what's their whole job? Well, they like to eat bacteria. So they are kind of your first line of defense in any sort of inflammatory response. So say you cut yourself, they're going to be the first ones there, ready to kill and eat anything that's there, but it definitely likes to eat and destroy bacteria, okay? And when they eat another thing, it's called to phagocytize, to eat something else. So these guys are phagocytic cells, okay? These guys also release a bit of enzymes into the area, so it can cause, that's why you have an inflammatory response, why it gets reddened and irritated, is because a lot of these white blood cells, even though they're trying to do good, they do also damage some of the tissue as well. So our second granulocyte is called an eosinophil. Now if you notice, they're quite a bit different than neutrophils. The nucleus is not as lobed, so there's not as many lobes. And those granules in the background are super bright, kind of reddish orange. So they stain very bright. So these guys, what eosinophils do, they are active during any sort of allergic reaction or parasitic infection. So really think parasitic infection. They do definitely do a lot in allergies as well, but they like to eat parasites. They also help to end allergic reactions a little bit too. So what they do is they like to eat allergens. So they phagocytize allergens and then they secrete enzymes to actually degrade histamine. And histamine is what causes kind of an allergic reaction. So not only do they eat parasites, they also eat allergens and they try to stop allergic reactions, okay? Which is different from some of our other cells. So our last granulocyte is a basophil, and these guys are super cool. I think they're awesome, but they are very rare to find in the blood. So usually you can hardly even see the nucleus under there. It's probably kind of like that. And then you notice all these very large, kind of dark purple granules. So that is the classic look of a basophil. Now what these guys do are they're very similar to mast cells. So they do secrete histamine as well, just like mast cells. So they function in allergic responses as well. So, but instead they're causing the allergic response instead of the eosinophils kind of stop the allergic response. Okay. They do a little bit in parasitic infections as well, but don't worry as much about that. So now let's look at our agranulocytes. So these guys do not have granules in their cytoplasm. So our first type of agranulocyte is a lymphocyte. So these guys are our main players in the immune system. These are the most important cells in the immune system. These other cells we've been talking about are very important in the inflammatory response, but the immune system is different, okay? So these guys are the second most abundant leukocyte, white blood cell, but they are definitely the main player in the immune system. These guys, so even though they kind of, like I said, all these white blood cells are going to move around the body in the bloodstream. They're going to diapedese or leave the bloodstream and into the tissues. And where these guys like to live are in the lymphoid tissues, such as the lymph nodes, the spleen, all of these different tonsils, all these different lymphoid tissues that we'll talk about in the immune and lymphatic system lecture. So these guys are a little bit smaller than our granulocytes, so the whole cell itself is a little bit smaller, but the big thing is that nucleus takes up the majority of the cell. So if you notice, it's mostly nucleus and then a little bit of cytoplasm on the outside. And these guys are really good at fighting infectious organisms such as viruses and bacteria, and they act very specifically. So that means each of these guys are looking for a specific antigen or a specific foreign molecule. Like this one type of lymphocyte is looking for this one type of virus, okay? And we'll talk a lot more about that when we talk about the immune system. So they're trained killers is what they are. So we have two different types of lymphocytes, and again, we'll talk more about this when we get to the immune system. But T cells and B cells are both lymphocytes, so they're just two different types of lymphocytes, and essentially they just have different jobs. So T cells like to attack foreign cells directly, okay? So they're kind of up close and personal attackers. They're like the melee fighters. And then the B cells, they turn into what is called a plasma cell, and they create and secrete antibodies. So then the antibodies are going to go out and flag down those bad cells for destruction. So they're a little bit more in the background. They don't attack cells directly. They secrete the antibodies to go attack them. And you cannot tell them apart. Like I could not tell you in this picture if that is a T cell or a B cell. You can. So our second type of agranulocyte is the monocyte. So these guys are pretty cool. They're not as abundant. They are the largest white blood cell, and their nucleus looks very much like a kidney bean. So it's kind of C-shaped, like a backward C or a kidney bean. And these guys are quite large, and what they become is they become macrophages. So once they go out of the bloodstream and into the tissues, they become macrophages. So if they're in the blood, they're a monocyte. If they're outside in the tissue, they are a macrophage. And the macrophage is a phagocytic cell, so essentially they eat pretty much everything. They're kind of like a waste compactor. They like to just eat everything. So they eat all the different pathogens. They eat any sort of cell that has been destroyed in any certain way. So they just like to, they're the cleanup crew of the body. They eat and destroy just about everything. So our last cell fragment is the platelet. So what a platelet is technically called is a thrombocyte. So thrombocytes are platelets and they're cell fragments. So they are fragments of a bigger cell called a megakaryocyte. Now a megakaryocyte is just a very large cell, and it just pieces of it break off and go into the bloodstream to become platelets. So these guys function in blood clotting. So we said that fibrinogen, one of our plasma proteins, is involved in clotting, and along with platelets, that's how we develop a clot. So fibrinogen turns into fibrin, and then fibrin, if you look at our picture over here, we have our red blood cells kind of sitting around, and then we have all this kind of stringy looking stuff. Now that's fibrin, okay? Now and here's a platelet. So what happens is the platelets activate all this fibrin and make it really sticky. And so all this fibrin sticks to all the red blood cells, creating a clot. So this is just explaining what I talked about in the last slide. Don't worry too much about all the details about these different clotting factors, but essentially just notice that fibrinogen, which is that plasma protein, turns into fibrin. Okay, so fibrin is what is going to actually stick to the red blood cells. But what happens is these platelets get activated, causing a very sticky clot, right? So all of these come together and become a big clot to plug the hole. So you stop bleeding. So where do all these blood cells come from? A lot of us know that the bone marrow is what is producing our blood cells. So this whole process of producing blood cells in the bone marrow is called hematopoiesis. So I want you to know that term. So hematopoiesis is the production of these blood cells. And when we talk about the bone marrow, we're specifically just talking about the red bone marrow. And the red bone marrow lives in the spongy bone, right? So we talked about the different areas of the bone, and the spongy bone contains that red bone marrow, okay? So the red bone marrow is what is producing, or the location for all these new blood cells being formed, okay? So let's look a little bit closer at the bone marrow. So we haven't looked too much into bone marrow yet. We know that the red bone marrow lives in the spongy bone of the bone tissue. And essentially, what is it? And it's a framework of that reticular connective tissue. Now, remember our different types of connective tissue, and we said reticular connective tissue has to do with kind of the lymphatic tissue. Well, it also is the framework for bone marrow. So if we look over here at our slide of our bone marrow, we can see a couple different things. So here's a trabeculae of the spongy bone. Okay, so we know we're in the spongy bone, and we have these big fat cells. So any of these white spaces is just going to be a fat cell. Okay, and then we've got a bunch of little kind of dark purple spots, and those are all the immature blood cells. So these are all the new cells that are forming. And essentially, once they're formed and they're mature enough, they have to get into the bloodstream. So they go through these things called the blood sinusoids. Okay, so we've kind of talked about sinuses before, and essentially they're these very large leaky capillaries, okay? And there you find them kind of all throughout the bone marrow in this reticular tissue, and it's how the mature blood cells enter the bloodstream. So it's how they get out of the bone marrow. And if you notice throughout, and we probably can't see them, but maybe some of these larger cells that you can see are macrophages. So essentially we have some mature immune cells just in case any bad pathogen enters the bone marrow, you want to be able to destroy it, and that's the job of the macrophage. So we have a few disorders of the blood. First, we'll be talking about some erythrocyte disorders, so some red blood cell disorders. And essentially, all of these are going to have a very similar side effect, and it's poor tissue oxygenation. Because what do red blood cells do? They carry oxygen. So if they can no longer do that, or you don't have enough of them to do that, then you don't get your tissues oxygenated very well. And so a lot of the side effects and symptoms of these disorders are due to that poor oxygenation. So our first type is polycythemia, and I know this is kind of strange, and it means that there are too many red blood cells. And that's strange because you'd think, okay, well, maybe that's a good thing to have a lot of red blood cells. Well, if you have too many red blood cells, that increases that hematocrit, that percent of red blood cells in the blood, because you're not increasing anything else. So there's the same amount of plasma, and what happens is it thickens the blood. So essentially the blood flow gets compromised. So even though you have a lot of red blood cells carrying a lot of oxygen, it can't actually get to the tissues very well. So it slows down the blood flow. And that's the problem with polycythemia. Now, anemia on the opposite end is a low level of red blood cells or erythrocytes. So you have a low hematocrit, so you have low hemoglobin concentration. Those are two different types of anemia. So there's lots of different types of anemia. So it can either be not enough red blood cells or not enough hemoglobin inside the red blood cells. But the whole outcome is the same, is that you can't carry enough oxygen on those red blood cells. And then last but not least is sickle cell disease, and this can be an inherited condition. And what happens is the shape of the red blood cell is defective. So instead of the normal biconcave shape, it has this sickle cell shape. So essentially it looks kind of like a half moon, crescent moon, and it can no longer carry a sufficient amount of oxygen. So people can live with sickle cell, and there's actually an advantage of sickle cell in areas with malaria, which is kind of interesting if you want to look that up. But it is an inherited condition, and you can live with it, but you just are poorly oxygenated, and it can limit you in many different ways. Okay. So we talked about the disorders of erythrocytes or red blood cells, but now we have a couple disorders with some other blood cells or formed elements. So we have some leukocyte disorders. Leukocyte just being the general term for white blood cell. So leukemia is a form of a blood-borne cancer. So because it's called leukemia, it doesn't specify the type of white blood cell that is affected. So you can have a couple different types of leukemia, whether it's lymphoblastic or myeloblastic, just means that it's the different type of white blood cell that is affected, the different lineage of white blood cell. But the disorder is in the bone marrow, so it doesn't produce normal white blood cells. So you have these dysfunctioning white blood cells, so your immune system is not functioning correctly. So that's, usually people with leukemia have to be in clean rooms because their immune system is shot. So platelet disorders, thrombocytes, right? So we have thrombocytopenia. So essentially we have not enough thrombocytes, not enough platelets. So you have a low concentration of platelets, therefore you're unable to clot correctly. So you have slow blood clotting times. It doesn't necessarily mean you can't clot your blood. It just means that it takes a lot longer for you to clot your blood, which can cause problems in and of itself. So this is just a table of the different formed elements to kind of show you the description of the cells, kind of these two areas here, how many cells you have in the blood and duration of lifespan. Don't worry too much about that, but it does show the function and kind of the look of the blood cells. So that's what I want you to kind of focus on. So here's the second part of that table. So don't pay attention to these two categories. Just mainly look at the function and the cell types. Okay. So this was a nice short lecture, so not too many learning objectives, but I do want you definitely to focus on, the different cells, what their functions are, all that good stuff. What is hematopoiesis? I want you to know that term. So just a nice short lecture for you guys, and then we will talk about the blood vessels as well in this kind of lecture group. Okay. So we'll be discussing chapter 20 or blood vessels in this same kind of lecture. Today we're kind of squeezing blood in with blood vessels. Okay? I just like that cartoon too.